It's one of my least favourite things ever to break up conversation, particularly because it's one of the reasons we're here. I'm going to do something silly. So we're kind of aiming for casual, yeah? And if you want to go and grab a bite to eat or drink, please do so. This is a conversation. I'm trying to prove that. My name's Patrick Lawrence. I'm the CEO at First Step. It's my great privilege to have that role. I started as a volunteer at First Step 21 years ago, and they still haven't managed to get rid of me. Right off the bat, I would like to thank my colleague Millie Katz-Nelson for putting on tonight's event. In case we forget later on, can we give her a round of applause now? I want to thank Tim and the team at Lord Somers Camp and Powerhouse for giving us this fantastic venue. Here we are on Upper Park Lake. It's just, you can't really, you sort of see it. It's a lovely spot, and here we are in our sort of greater St Kilda and surrounds community. There's an exit the way you came in, there's another exit at the back, and the toilets are up the back as well. In case you haven't done this already, and I'll judge by the reaction when I say this, please meet your neighbour. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. If you haven't sort of said your name, please do that now. Okay, come on, what happens? How long does it take to meet your neighbour? Okay, that was fantastic. Now, a moment's seriousness. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. Here, as many of you know, is the Yalika Willem clan of the Boonwurrung people. They are people of the water, and their lands extend right down to the other side of the inner Melbourne and the Bay, where I live, over in Altona North. I want to acknowledge also that we're at a particularly special time at the moment. We're having a week of focus on reconciliation. It's bookmarked with some other important events like Sorry Day. At First Step, we're a little bit excited about the fact that the Uluru Statement from the Heart might be taken seriously at the highest levels of government, and we're hopeful that the First Nations people of Australia have a voice at Parliament soon. Tonight we're going to have a great conversation. It's going to be intelligent, informed, compassionate, spontaneous. I have no idea what anyone's going to talk about, and I'm really excited. I'm really just waiting for it to happen. We have, I want to point out a couple of particularly brave and insightful speakers who will be speaking from their own lived experience of addiction. The rest of us can probably just all go home, really. We're kind of window dressing, but we'll hang around and we'll just try to sort of, keep the conversation flowing a little bit. One really fabulous thing about tonight is that we'll have all sorts of insights, and at the end of it we won't be saying, well, that's good and well, but who out there really cares? Who out there is really doing anything? Well, a lot of people are doing and caring. We are absolutely in a reform period at the moment, and it is super duper exciting. It would be embarrassing and remiss if we did not have lived experience on the panel tonight, right? That's unacceptable these days. That voice is being recognised as absolutely essential for any kind of positive reform. We've got the Naloxone Reforms at the moment, which is going to save lives from being able to reverse opiate overdoses. We've got, I'm at a consultation, probably with some of you guys this Friday, with Department of Justice and VicPol to talk about a trial of decriminalisation of personal quantities of currently illicit drugs. We've got a medically supervised injecting room. Some people here have worked in that room. We're going to have a second one. The one in Sydney, Catherine was awarded the keys to the city, the director. These things have been taken seriously, and we have a Prime Minister who has said repeatedly and openly and proudly that addiction is a health issue. And we're confident that further reforms at state and federal and every other level will come. Not to mention, here in City Port Phillip, some very sympathetic and engaged councillors. But I'm not doing introductions. I'm almost done. Someone on the panel who shall remain nameless, reminded me of a fabulous quote that I would like to finish on from Martin Luther King. The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Personally, I have to believe that that is true. I do believe that it's true. And tonight, we're going to work at just bending it just a little bit more. That's why we're here. I would like to introduce the MC for tonight. This is it for me now. Simon Mckeon. Simon is still the Chancellor of Monash University, I believe. Still a former Australian of the Year. They haven't taken that away from you, I don't think. 2011? Yep. You'd be due to come round again, wouldn't you? Every 10 years or so? No? And most importantly, a former First Step volunteer. Can you give Simon a round of applause to welcome him?
Thank you, Patrick. I thought you were going to leave the food for me. No. Welcome everybody. Indeed, it falls upon me firstly to formally welcome Mark Watt, the chair of, put your hand up Mark, chair of First Step. Emma Cadogan is manager workforce, mental health division of the Department of Health. Hi Emma. And also Tim Baxter, I was just talking to Tim a moment ago, Deputy Mayor of the City of Port Phillip. But I also welcome all of you, sector workers, clinicians, philanthropic supporters of First Step and other supporters of First Step, champions of drug law reform and advocates for compassion in drug treatment. And if you don't fall under any of those headings, then welcome anyway. But this is not the first time First Step has brought together a group of committed and influential people, not to hear some lecture on how something must happen because it's so crystal clear, but to actually engage in something that's actually damn difficult, in which humanity is still sometimes clumsily and sometimes very adeptly making progress. This is society's, one of society's toughest issues by a long shot. I come from a normal family, and in my normal family, if I think, does middle and outer rings a little bit, every now and then I hear of stories of addiction. It is that simple. And I'm not sure of too many families or people in families that don't have a similar experience. A lot of it's hushed up, a lot of it's contained, a lot of it's not the sort of stuff that people like to talk about on a Saturday night at a dinner party, but it's very real and it's much more prevalent than any of us would like to acknowledge. One of the things I love about First Step, and I am not someone who's been on the board of First Step or been a committed volunteer year in, year out for 20 years. I was so lucky when once upon a time I did work full time to be in the investment banking sector. Great to see you here, John. I haven't seen you for what, 20 years, Johnny? Johnny Knights. And the great thing about First Step is to see wonderful people we haven't seen for a long time.
We try.
And this funny old industry of investment banking, full of talented people like Johnny here, very time poor, impossible to nail down for regular non-for-profit, for-purpose commitments. That's just the way it is. And it got under my skin a little bit, and I was just so fortunate because around 20 years ago, when First Step was starting up with Patrick there, I don't know how I actually heard about it, Patrick, but I heard that they were investigating this fabulous program which put addicts who were trying to kick the habit in touch with so-called regular people, i.e. non-addicts. And part of the secret was to connect them by phone, not on a regular time basis or whatever, but whatever worked for each of them. I said, aha, perhaps this is one thing that my busy flock of people at the investment bank can actually, in their own time and in their own circumstances, connect with someone else and possibly help, or better still, help each other. But it got better than that, because as I got to know a little bit more about Patrick and the wonderful work that First Step was done, we weren't allowed to go anywhere near a phone, let alone someone with a tough habit, without going through one of the most eye-opening training programs I've ever been to. Basic counselling to many of you. Someone like me, an absolute eye-opener. Week after week, we went to this wonderful program. And I learned stuff at, I'm a very old person now, and I was pretty old then, and just absolutely eye-opening stuff in terms of personal relationships and how to conduct oneself in a difficult situation. As I said, I haven't had the commitment to be on the board of First Step or to be a regular supporter over all those 20 years, but I've been so fortunate because Patrick's kept in touch with me, and every now and then just let me know the journey of First Step. And all I would say from a little distance away is that it's rare, and in my case anyway, that you see an organisation that is not only so focused on its clients, the people that it's really trying to help, but so willing to try new things, to keep what's worked in the past, but always have an open mind as to what can even work better again. That's pretty challenging sometimes because it takes so much to put in place. Processes and policies and things that organisations need. But then Patrick kept on saying, but how can we do this better? And it was entirely appropriate because I said at the start, this is one of the toughest areas that society has to deal with, week in, week out. And so tonight, as I said, there won't be any perfect lecture saying, fellas, this is how we do it. There's no other way. No, tonight is all about open minds, and there are people from government, decision makers, all sorts of people who can perhaps take the conversation the First Step is hosting tonight and perhaps change. Won't always work, but at the end of the day, if the motivation is right, that what we're trying to do is just to improve lives, then that's got to be the way forward. It's interesting, Patrick made reference to the once leader of the opposition, who's now Prime Minister. It's been a big week for those of you who don't know. There was an election a little over a week ago. And I found a quote from Albo, and indeed, Alex, I didn't get a chance to thank you for this, but I heard it via Nellie, who apparently got it from you. Now, you might have thought that Albo over the last year or two has had plenty of opportunity to get stuck into the recently retired Prime Minister. Indeed, he said these words in Parliament: I rise tonight to express my great concern for the Prime Minister's blinkered and short-sighted views, blah, 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 blah. We've probably heard those sorts of words a lot over the last several years as Albo has been Leader of the Opposition. But he actually said these words as a brand new entrant to Parliament back in the 1990s at 10:30 one night. When was it? March 1999. He said, I'll say it again, I rise tonight to express my great concern for the Prime Minister's, a different Prime Minister, Howard, blinkered and short-sighted views on the problem of drug abuse in our community. In particular, I wish to speak in favour of the proposed heroin trials and against the policy of zero tolerance. And straight after that, he uttered the following wise words: and I do not pretend to have the answer to the problem of drug addiction. But then his speech went on. And he had a glimpse at the US with its zero tolerance policies and what have you. But he was actually raising the right question. How can we be better? Because clearly what we have at the moment is not what we want. So tonight we have a terrific program. As Patrick said, we're going to kick off shortly with a keynote from Baden Hicks, then Dr. Alex Wodak, Dr. Q Lee on my right here, and finishing up with Dr. Shalini Aranogiri. Not bad, pass, yeah, good. And then, and I'm putting you on notice right now, the conversation starts. And I think it's going to be a great night. Now, theoretically, we have to draw up stumps at 8 o'clock. I think we can go a few minutes after that in terms of this big group, but we'll then have to stop at some point. But please linger after that. There will be an opportunity to mix in small groups and what have you. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Baden to the microphone. Baden Hicks battled with addiction for 20 years. At the age of 15, he was living on the streets, and by 16, had his first of many stints in rehab. Over those 20 years, Baden experienced 17 heroin overdoses, spent time in ICU and on life support. And as he says, he was a mess. He met Michelle Goldberg, First Step legal principal lawyer at Windana, and she linked him into all the services First Step could offer him. Baden's now been in recovery for 18 months. He works part-time as a pharmacotherapy peer support worker at Turning Point and volunteers his time at First Step as a peer support worker. He's also a passionate advocate for a more compassionate and humane response to people who use drugs. It's great to have you tonight, Baden.
Hi everyone, my name is Baden Hicks and I'm really pleased to be here tonight to share my story, and I'd like to thank First Step for inviting me to be part of this event. Who would have thought 4 years ago I was homeless, living on the streets, injecting meth and heroin. I had raging psychosis, my mental health was shot, and had a raging drug habit. We do recover though. Now my dream job as a peer support worker at Turning Point. I'm volunteering as peer support at another amazing organisation called First Step in their Reset Life program. I'm part of the Melbourne University Powerlifting Club, have a great apartment, and have reconnected with significant family members. I began using drugs as a medication to treat mental health. Growing up, I was struggling with home life and with school. So when I used drugs in my teens, I felt relief like I had never felt before. It was the first instance of drugs being helpful in my life. I'm 36 years old now, and for 20 years I struggled with addiction. My substance use ranged from marijuana to meth and opioids, including heroin. For 14 years, it was fairly functional addiction. I was working as a boilermaker and a welder, earning good money, working in the mines. I completed highly skilled trade certificates. I became a competitive diver and worked in the dive industry for 8 years. I've always been a hard worker, so I could lead this double life. But being a functioning addict is really hard work. I'd still be hitting rock bottoms and be in and out of rehab, which I disguised with many excuses. I don't know how many times I said I had glandular fever, but it was my way of self-medicating mental health. Drugs were the only coping mechanism I had. In the last 6 years of my addiction, I became extremely reckless and unfunctional. It was spurred by losing custody of my daughter unfairly. My drug use was used against me, and I felt powerless. It was heartbreaking and traumatic, and my way of coping was to up the drug use. But there was never enough drugs to make me feel good. The emotional pain was always slightly more than the drug's ability to numb it. I was extremely suicidal and needed meth and heroin more than I needed oxygen to keep me alive. I was hanging around with other IV users and dealing to support my drug use. In that time, I had 17 heroin overdoses. I was stuck in a cycle. Without those drugs, I was at risk of suicide. So chasing that never-ending goal of achieving that first high was keeping me alive. Then when I did want help, there was none around. I needed serious intervention, but it wasn't within my reach. I went through an endless cycle of being admitted to private rehabs over the years, places I didn't get anything out of except temporary reduction in my tolerance. I'd leave and be out using again because of the lack of education and recovery strategies. It just became a revolving door. The heroin got really out of control. I was homeless, not mentally well, not using sterile injecting equipment, using the same needles over and over again. I ended up with necrotic skin and big holes in my flesh. The self-care part of me was gone. I practiced no harm reduction and had to learn everything from my mistakes. That's why I love working in harm reduction. I can help people not end up where I did. The other people who used drugs I was hanging around were always having to do CPR on me whilst calling the ambulances. The last time I used heroin, I mixed it with Lyrica and a number of other drugs. When the ambos arrived, they had to inject me with Naloxone 3 times because the Lyrica had made the Naloxone resistant. And I ended up on life support in the ICU in a coma for 3 days. That's when I tried to cut down on the heroin and made up for it with meth. I developed a raging meth habit and was sectioned to psych wards a number of times. They are not nice places. I ran off from one of them and went to my parents' house while they were overseas. I used there and OD'd, and the police came looking for me because I was sectioned. Kicked in the door and called an ambulance. I was in a coma and taken to the ICU and put on life support again. And when I woke, I was transferred back to the psych ward, out of the frying pan and into the fire. In the bigger picture, drugs nearly took my life, but they also bought me time. The turning point was when I met a lawyer out at Windana. She helped me with legal stuff, and after I left, she tracked me down. I was out on the street using very heavily. I hadn't slept in 3 weeks, and due to raging psychosis, I was sectioned into a psych ward where I was having drugs smuggled in and still using. Michelle somehow found out I was there and rang saying she still wanted to represent me and organised an appointment for legal assistance at First Step. While I was there, she very swiftly introduced me to their mental health team. With their help, I managed to get 2 weeks off the drugs and get into the Reset Life program and started working on my substance use. I was still struggling mentally, but I had these 3 amazing support people: a psychologist, AOD facilitator, and lawyer. I had a relapse during the program when COVID hit and it went online. I just lost my structure of going into First Step. I didn't want to use drugs, but it was enough to get me back in jail again. When I got out, I went back and completed the program and graduated. These people went above and beyond their professional role and really got behind me. I had serious trust issues, and that show of support allowed me to slowly start to develop trust again in people. I honestly thought there were no good people in the world, and now I know that is not true. But I still had trauma from the night I got arrested and went to jail and lost everything. I had 1 set of clothes when they released me. I really needed something to deal with that and the underlying trauma. So I used marijuana as a coping mechanism. It got me by. It was fantastic in the beginning. It gave me relief. I could sleep, it de-stressed me, It made me laugh. It had been years since I'd laughed. But as my tolerance went up, I had to use more and more without it having the effect it used to. So I called Ben at First Step, and he said, okay, come down and have a coffee. He offered me to do the Reset Life program again. So I did and hit the ground running. I'd worked on my addiction issues and reset, but still had a lot of mental health issues, and I was desperate to find a way to deal with them. The antidepressant prescribed to me was giving me nothing but terrible side effects. I started researching psychedelics, and I knew they could help with mental health and addiction issues. I'd used them in the past to get over a raging meth habit. It really worked. I just used psychedelics and gave it all up, but I had no support at the time. So I decided to get people on board to support me with it. I spoke about it with a GP and a psychologist, and they agreed to support me as I worked through the trauma. I'd researched doses and how to use them. I used a journal to write up things I wanted to process and deal with traumas and resentments. Drugs like methamphetamine and heroin were like a band-aid to my painful wounds. But psychedelics got to the deep cause of them and helped them heal. I found the psychedelics experience would give me insights and perspectives. And having therapy alongside it allowed me to work on these issues. It was a key turning point with some things, especially with resentments of people. I had all these unjustified resentments because I didn't know how to deal with it. When I took them into a psychedelic experience, they'd just be bang gone. I did psychedelic therapy myself because firstly, I'd been diagnosed as medication resistant. So once off the drugs, I had no medication support for my mental health. Secondly, because it's not available here in Australia, because psychedelics are illegal, I had to educate myself on them. Because I was educated on them, the most dangerous thing about them for me was being caught with them. Using psychedelics has been my own personal journey. Psychedelics have helped me overcome mental health and addiction issues and had a profound impact on my life. But in saying that, there's no magic bullet. I've had to do a hell of a lot of therapy, and Reset Life was the best rehabilitation program I'd come across to do that, and it's been the standout beneficial treatment that was needed. To end my talk, I'd just like to give a shout out and massive thank you to everyone at First Step, especially Michelle Goldberg and Ben Vinker. Michelle for tracking me down and all the support she's given me over the years, which has been beyond just legal support. And Ben for putting faith in me when I had no faith in myself. Ben stood by me every step of the way. He was more than just another AOD worker. He was a mentor and went above and beyond like Michelle did. Also, two of my closest mates that aren't here tonight, Jordan Rinaldi and Peter Trussler. These two guys supported me through the worst of times. Even when people said to Jordan, "Are you sure Baden's not too far gone?" He said, "Nah, Baden's going to come back," and they never gave up on me. Thanks for letting me speak.
To kick off tonight, Baden. Thanks so much. I can see Ben down in the back row just humbly hiding away. Michelle's not here tonight, is she? No. Yeah,
but we do have representatives from First Step Legal. Lisa, would you like to wave? And you can pass that on to Michelle.
I will indeed, yes.
There's a very lovely picture of Michelle and Baden on the front page of our most recent annual report. If anyone wants to look that up, it's an absolute ripper because she's about 2 feet shorter than him.
Thanks again, Baden. Real story, not Hollywood. Real story, real honesty. Thanks so much. Now, our first formal panel speaker, Dr. Alex Wodek, worked in the alcohol and drug field for 3 decades with a great interest in harm reduction and drug law reform. He was the Director of Alcohol and Drug Services at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, between 1982 and 2012. And during that time, he and his colleagues started the first needle syringe program, and the first medically supervised injecting centre in this country. When both were pre-legal, he was the foundation president of the International Harm Reduction Association and helped establish the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre and the New South Wales Users AIDS Association, a drug user organisation. In 2010, Dr. Wodak was made a member of the Order of Australia for service to medicine and public health, particularly in the area of drug and alcohol dependency treatment through legislative reform and to medical education. Today, Dr. Wodak dedicates his time to drug law reform and is a board member of the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association and advocates for vaping, a form of tobacco harm reduction. Great to have you tonight, Alex.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and thank you also to all you wonderful people who have come here tonight on a cold, wet night with winter rapidly approaching. Very much appreciated that you've come here. This is an important subject, and it's a difficult subject, and it's very important that we talk about it. We can't make progress with any issue unless we sit around and talk about it, and where those discussions are polite and respectful and involve people from different views, different backgrounds, and that's what we're doing tonight. I'm going to talk about three subjects: drugs, people who use drugs, and thirdly, what can we do about the mess we've got. So let's talk about drugs. Well, we start off, I think, recognising that the war on drugs has been a colossal failure. How do we know that it's been a failure? Well, there are two ways of looking at this. One is looking at the drug market itself, and then looking at the consequences of the policy. If we look at the drug market, we see that it has expanded exponentially over the last 50 or 80 years, not just in Australia, all over the world. Not only has the quantity of drugs increased, but also the hazardousness, the dangerousness, the riskiness of the drugs that are being used has also steadily increased. And I'll explain why that happens in a moment. But the important point is the drug market is a lot worse in 2022 than it was 60 years ago or 80 years ago when these policies started being adopted. They weren't adopted overnight, they came in gradually. The second way of looking at this is the consequences. And if we look at deaths, disease, crime, corruption, violence, they have all got steadily worse. Australia banned heroin in 1955, banned the production and importation of heroin to be precise. In 1955, heroin stocks were still available, had been used medically up until 1955, and it continued being used medically, legally, until stocks were exhausted. We couldn't produce more stocks or bring in new stocks. But the problem started after heroin was banned, not before heroin was banned. And that's a point very few people realise. How many drug overdose deaths were there in Australia in 1964? 6. How many deaths from drug overdose, it's a bit more complicated now, were there last in 2020 in Australia? 1,800. So we've gone from 6 to 1,800. That's not progress. The United States has had increasing deaths from drug overdose every year for the last 20 years and have now reached 108,000 in 2021. And adjusting that for our population, there'd be 7,000, 8,000 deaths from drug overdose in Australia. So we're not as bad as the United States, but our drug overdose death rate has also been increasing for almost 20 years, and things could get a lot worse. We could get like the United States, or Canada, or the United Kingdom, which has much worse figures than we do on these areas. So what's driving this? Why do things get worse? The explanation for this is what's called the iron law of prohibition. And what that refers to is the more you press down on a legal and illegal market, the more dangerous the drugs become. So when rich white male consultants went to Asia half a century ago to tell people in Asia what drug policies they should have, we managed to switch from elderly men, people like me, smoking opium, to young sexually active men injecting heroin. That's what happened, because heroin occupies, for the same biological impact, 1/10 of the volume of opium, and opium stinks, and heroin's got slight smells. Opium pipes are very hard to hide. Needles and syringes are easy to hide. So if you want to make a bad problem worse, particularly a bad drug problem, put a lot of law enforcement pressure on it, and you'll get more dangerous drugs. And there is example after example after example of exactly that happening all around the world. Now, the obvious question is, if the drug policy, the war on drugs policy that we've embraced around the world and enthusiastically implemented has been such a catastrophic failure, why do we intensify and keep on implementing it decade after decade after decade? And the reason is that it's been a failure as a policy in every way you can imagine, but it's been a huge success as a political strategy. You can get the most unelectable candidate elected if he or she embraces the war on drugs. That's how it used to be. It's starting to change. So we have politicians now who are realizing that embracing drug prohibition is a liability, but accepting and supporting harm reduction and drug law reform is an asset, a political asset. So that's starting to change. When you think about it, it's not really difficult to work out that the war on drugs has to fail. After all, we all know that we can't keep drugs out of our prisons. So if we can't keep drugs out of our prisons, how on earth can we keep drugs out of St Kilda or Footscray or Mount Druitt or Blacktown or anywhere else for that matter? Secondly, if a kilogram of heroin wholesale costs $1,000 in Bangkok and costs $200,000 in Melbourne, why is it not going to travel from Bangkok to Sydney, Melbourne, London, Paris? And it does. Thirdly, think about it, the drug traffickers are better resourced than drug law enforcement. So of course, they're going to win and our guys are going to lose, and that's exactly what happened. Herb Stein, the economic advisor to former President Richard Nixon, had a saying that's often quoted, "Things that can't last forever don't." And this is a policy that isn't going to last forever. Let's hope it doesn't last too much longer. The quote that you've already heard, the Martin Luther King quote, is very important. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The first African slaves arrived in the United States 1619, 150 years before the first organization in the United States set up to abolish slavery. So reform takes a long time. Don't be fooled by the fact that we try and often don't see a reward for our efforts. If we keep going, we will win, and we have won many battles already. Let's talk about people who use drugs. People who use drugs have not always, but have often had tragic childhoods. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, boys as well as girls. And sometimes they've had terrific childhood, terrific families. But sometimes they've had terrific childhood, terrific families, but they have their own internal demons that chase them and pursue them, and somehow to keep afloat they find that they can use illicit drugs and cope. And sometimes people who have got into a very dark place in their lives have found that using illicit drugs helps keep them alive, stops them taking their own life. And I've heard that comment, and almost everyone I imagine who's worked in this field has heard people confide that to you. The amazing thing about drug policy is that we see again and again people with miserable lives, and the authorities make their lives even worse. We take away their children, we take away their health, we take away their savings, we take away their career, we destroy their lives, and what do? They keep using drugs. Why should we be astonished by this? The definition of addiction that is most often used scientifically, there are several definitions, the one that's used most often is that addiction is the continuous use of drugs despite severe adverse consequences. So we make the severe adverse consequences even more severe, and guess what? People use drugs. Well, the scientific definition predicts that that's exactly what's going to happen, and that's what does happen. So what can we do about all this? Well, the first thing we have to do about this is talk about this, work together, build networks, and build movements. Building networks is good, building movements even better. Second thing we have to do is we have to listen to people who use drugs. Now, people who use drugs don't have a monopoly on wisdom, and people who are doctors or other healthcare professionals don't have a monopoly on wisdom either. But get all of us around the table, and there's a lot of wisdom in that room, and the bad ideas will be knocked out by the better ideas. I think it's very important to tell politicians and tell the communities our stories, the stories of people who use drugs, the stories of people who try to help people who use drugs, the stories of people who try to change drug policy. Our stories really matter, they're very powerful. The research that matters as well. That's a more systematic way of acquiring that knowledge. But the stories are really powerful for politicians. And it's the politicians who are the only people who can really change things. And dare I remind you, you have state elections coming up in November, wink wink. So what else can we do? Be compassionate and accepting. We've been struggling with that in Australia for quite a few years. We've turned our back on First Nation people, on refugees, on women, on people who use drugs. And let's hope that May the 21st is a turning point where we start to take a different attitude and realise that we have to be kinder and gentler to our brothers and sisters, our sons and daughters, our fathers and mothers, our nephews and nieces who have started using drugs and struggling. We have to recognise the need for major change, but major change rarely comes as a revolution. It usually happens as an evolution in incremental stages. So that's what I think we have to argue for. We have to argue for an approach which is based on reducing harm rather than obsessed with using use. And often when you set out to reduce harm, you end up reducing use anyway. And it's much more effective than when you're obsessed with reducing or eliminating use. I think we have to also accept that we need a broad-based approach. A health approach is important, it's good. More drug treatment, better drug treatment, more attractive drug treatment, all of that's fine. But we also need to recognise that a lot of people struggling with severe drug problems really need a lot of social support. They need help getting a job. There's nothing better that you can do for someone struggling with a drug problem but help them get a job. Often they need housing. Some of our so-called health problems are really housing problems. And let's hope that that starts to improve soon too. Johann Hari, when he was in Australia last time, said that we've spent 50 years hating people who use drugs. It's time that we started trying to see what happens when we love them. I think he's got a point. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but Alex, thank you. And actually very timely. I mean, I'm not here to give a political speech tonight, but you know, the issue of empathy, understanding this complex world we're in, and indeed what each individual has on his or her plate to deal with. Thank you. Next we have Dr. Q Lee. Dr. Q is a psychiatry resident with Monash Health based at Casey Hospital. His alter ego is that of a harm reduction practitioner. Dr. Lee has been active in the harm reduction promotion and public mental health space and has worked in the AOD sector for over 5 years. During that time, he established Windana's harm reduction program and worked in the AOD strategy team for the Victorian Department of Health. Currently, Dr. Lee is part of the team at the medically supervised injecting room and is an enthusiastic group facilitator at Bunjawara, an Indigenous youth rehabilitation facility. He's also recently joined the Health Promotion Outreach Initiative with Southeast Public Health Unit, Monash Health, and the Centre for Multicultural Youth in Dandenong. Tim? Yeah, Tim and I are both Dandenong boys, so thank you, Q. Providing harm reduction and mental health support to South Sudanese homeless youth. He has a lived experience of addiction and is passionate about recovery, addressing shame, stigma, and discrimination. Ladies and gentlemen, Q.
Thanks for having me tonight. Thanks, Pat. I've been friends for a little while now. I think I first met Patrick at the World Largest Overdose Prevention training back in pre-COVID. It was, I think, yeah, it was pre-COVID. I was working at Windana as a harm reduction practitioner, and about 16 months before that, I got caught using drugs as a junior doctor. Yeah. I think I'll just start with my first story, I guess. Getting invited to something like this tonight was sort of out of the blue for me. I'm just quite junior in my training, so I feel a little bit underqualified being here. My boss is at the back. Anyway, so here goes nothing, I guess. So I'm from Korea originally. That's South Korea for those who are not well aware of the North and South situation. My dad was a violent guy. He was quite a violent, reckless guy when I was growing up. Even my first memory of him was, coming back home and the house being turned upside down. So I got sort of used to that, and it was quite normal actually. I thought I had it quite good because I didn't get my head bashed in, every weekend like some of my friends did. So I thought I actually had it pretty good. But there was an overwhelming, what I now identify as anxiety that has been carried along throughout my childhood, and actually what drove me to excel academically when I wasn't using drugs. And that was sort of my coping strategy back in high school and then back in university, but that didn't last very long. It went on to sleeplessness. And very different to Baden's story. I had no idea how to score illicit drugs, but I was a trained pharmacist, and then in college during my first year of med school, being in college, what do we do during summer breaks? Cannabis. That was the drug of choice. I had no idea how they scored cannabis. It just came out during parties, and I took a whiff of first hit, and that changed my entire life. Of course, I did not know drugs. I did not seek drugs. I did not cope with alcohol or anything like that, but that cured everything, that fixed everything, until it didn't, until I got lazy, until I got the munchies. I was getting fat and lazy, and that didn't work for me. So in my third year of medical school, which was the first year of the Doctor of Medicine at Melbourne Uni, that was a very ruthless year because it was back-to-back rotations, no breaks, and that was when I confronted my dad for the first time. He tried to pick up a chair and hit my mom, and I finally had the balls to fight him for the first time in my life, which is something that we don't do in Korea. That is, you know, I stand up here sort of talking crap about my parents is not something we do in Korea. That's not the right thing to do, and that really sort of held me back a lot, I think, and really shoved me into a dark place for a very long time. And I finally confronted him, and the police intervention was the first time in my life that happened, and that family shame, that stigma of having that family structure loss in my society has really isolated my family and myself for a very long time, actually. So that was sort of the turmoil point, and that's when I started stealing scripts. At the time I was doing my pediatric rotations at the Royal Children's. I stole a bunch of scripts, which was super easy to do, and I started writing up all sorts of stuff. I tried antidepressants, I really did, and it didn't work. I didn't have that instant effect that I was craving. What I didn't even identify as craving, actually, something I needed immediately to work. And I wanted to do well in uni, I wanted to work, I wanted to sleep, I wanted to function, and my sleep and wake cycle was completely overtaken by opioid and benzodiazepines, sleeping tablets for some that don't know. And I don't believe I was addicted, so to speak. I was definitely a bad coping strategy, but it slowly crept up from 1 to 2 to 3 months and 3 weeks, and it just got out of hand very quickly. And actually, I got caught very, very, not much of a peak of a story, but I got caught with a Shepperton script in Melbourne for some sleeping tablets at a city pharmacy off my face. And thank God for that, because my next rotation that was coming up was anesthetics. And I was already thinking about putting a cannula in and going all out. And thank God I got caught, because the lack of insight that ensued, like I look back and sometimes I tell my story and it doesn't feel like it was me. It doesn't, I can't believe that happened, but it did. It absolutely did. And that was the, thank God I got caught. So for some of the people, I think a very, very small percentage of people, sometimes the justice system or a barrier to getting that medication or whatever fix you need, having that tier system, that place to sort of kick you into a wake-up call is very much needed. And I didn't need antidepressant thereafter. I didn't need replacement therapy. I didn't require. I didn't want that, actually. And I took a different path. I have to say, I did a lot of psychotherapy, but I did a lot of resistance training. I did a lot of breathing. I did a lot of re-engaging with pain, and that's my story. And I got used to pain again, and not in a bad way, not in a self-inflicting pain way, but in a very performance sort of path. And having a job, having a roof over your head absolutely helped. And thank God for those peer organizations that really empowered me and sort of stripped that layer of shame and stigma that I carried on for so long. That it was so heavy. It's the heaviest thing I've ever carried. And I practice as a doctor, and I practice as a harm reduction practitioner and all that sort of stuff. But going through that recovery process, God, it was hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I've done med school, I did pharmacy school, I've done a master's in public health, and that was easy. I can tell you that was easy. Recovery is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Yeah, and no, the inpatient psych unit is not easy, but the recovery is so non-structured, and I want to help bring some sort of structure, some sort of streamline, some sort of system back. And I think these events are very important because, like doing the Master of Public Health, working in government, we have to think system. We can't think isolated, island hubs. We have to think of it as an ecosystem that we live in. And I have to say, I'm a pretty selfish guy. And if I wanted my community to be awesome, I would actually invest in it. That would be something selfish to do, and I think that's why I'm here tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Q. Can I just say, I'm getting pretty tired. There's every time a magnificent speaker and I have to get up in the middle of it and say something. Q, really, I just looked around and you really could have again heard a pin drop. Your honesty, Baden's honesty. It's remarkable. Finally, as far as panel speakers are concerned, before we open it up, Dr. Shalini Arunagiri is a clinical addiction psychiatrist and an NHMRC Emerging Leader Research Fellow. And has extensive experience working across alcohol and other drug and mental health services. She's chair of the RANZCP Faculty of Addiction Psychiatry, board member for the International Society of Addiction Medicine, senior research fellow at Monash Addiction Research Centre, and deputy clinical director at Turning Point. She has over 50 peer-reviewed publications. My gosh, why aren't you 83? And over $14 million of research funding following completion of a PhD in methamphetamine psychosis. She's also a passionate advocate for women in medicine and research, and a mum to an energetic 6-year-old boy. Shalini is passionate about delivering better care for people with addictions and related mental health problems and for their families and communities. Her hope is that one day soon, your words, one day soon, people with an addiction will be able to get the evidence-based treatment they need when they seek it, without facing stigma, discrimination, or barriers. Shalini.
Thank you for that, and let me say, first of all, to follow Baden, to follow Hugh, to follow Alex Waddock, just such luminaries before me, and I think they've all touched on points that I was probably going to say anyway, so I'm going to have to very quickly think on my feet and provide something original for us to discuss in our Q&A. I think partly coming here tonight, it's just such a pleasure to be able to be invited along to this event, and thank you to Patrick and First Step for having me along. It's so lovely to be able to talk about something that I think is close to all of our hearts in terms of the people in the room here. I think what I love about working in addiction is that everyone who is in this space is super passionate about what we do. I think it's really aligned with our own core values, and it brings people together who really care deeply about sort of justice and about equity for the people that we support. So with that in mind, I think what I wanted to talk about today is 3 things that come up against those values for me, and why I kind of work in this space and continue to do the work I do. First of all, I think is a premise that Patrick put to us, I think as speakers to kind of bring to this room and talk about. And that's a premise around illicit drugs being bad. Are they bad? And what we think about that. And I guess the first thing that came to my mind as a psychiatrist, as a doctor working in this space, to me, drugs are substances, and they're substances that have some sort of effect. And I think the uniting factor there in terms of what we consider as a society, what we consider as drugs, is really the uniting factor is that they have an effect for people that people seek. So they're pleasurable, they have some effect on people that actually helps us, it helps us feel better. And that's true for a whole range of things that we classify as drugs. It's true for alcohol, tobacco, it's true for many of the illicit drugs, it's true for caffeine, and it's probably going to be true for a whole range of other things that we start to understand in terms of behavioral addictions as well. So the common uniting factor there is that these substances actually have a purpose for many individuals, but are they in and of themselves bad? And I think for me that question is not perhaps the right question to ask, whether the drug itself is bad, whether the substance itself is bad. because at the end of the day, all they are substances, and it's how we as a society look at them in terms of what we hold up and in terms of how we make judgments about the drugs, but also the people who use them, and what happens around their use. And when I think about people who come into the health system when they use drugs, what we see in that interface is that people are presenting with a symptom of a problem. They're presenting, for instance, following an overdose, or they're presenting with methamphetamine psychosis. They're presenting with a whole range of different problems related to what we see on the surface, the substance. And with that substance, kind of what we see is the substance is causing these issues, stop using the substance, and the issues will go away. And I guess as a doctor thinking about this, came to mind that it's very different from how we treat many other health disorders. For instance, when we see someone come into the emergency department with a fever, currently with a fever you'd go through a whole protocol, you'd be, championed off to the other side of the unit, you'd have PPE on, blah, blah, things have changed during the pandemic. But if you came in with a fever, the first thing the person would be trying to understand is what's driving that fever, what is the problem that sits behind that fever. Sure, they'd give you some Panadol and they try to make the fever go away, but what they're invested in as a health system is really being able to treat the underlying cause of the problem. And for me, working in addiction, what we currently offer is treatment in many settings, and there are definitely pockets of excellence there, there's pockets of excellence here, I think, but overall what we're talking about is really very much treating that surface of treating the substances, talking about how we make the substances go away, focusing on helping the person stop using, and the absence of drug use is what we're actually trying to achieve for the person. But what's underneath that in terms of what's actually driving the substance use, why the person's actually using in the first place, as Alex Wadeth mentioned before, in the actual definition of addiction, we have the idea that someone's continuing to use despite those negative consequences. So why is that? Why is that actually happening? And that's what's sitting underneath the substance use itself. And so if we treated addiction like any other health disorder, what we could be doing in terms of treatment is really helping people unpack that, is really helping to understand with the individual walking alongside them, both trying to help and unpack and understand what's happened along the way, what's led to the substance potentially no longer actually meeting your needs anymore, potentially not actually working for what you're using it for. I have the privilege of working as a clinician with people who actually want to stop using largely because they're finding that the substance is no longer working for them, and I have the privilege of hearing their stories, understanding what's led to that point. And so in that point, when the person's actually trying to get better, trying to engage in recovery, that process is really that first step of starting to understand what's happened before that. And that brings me on to the next thing that I think, it's really exciting for me that lots of people are talking about and lots of people are actually investing in and thinking about now is, for so many people, what's sitting underneath that is trauma, and what's sitting underneath that is the actual experience of what we consider as post-traumatic stress disorder for so many people. If you look at kind of statistics internationally and here in Australia too, we think that about 1 in 2 people who kind of come into addiction treatment settings are actually having symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now if you just think about that's 1 in 2, that's every second person that's coming into a treatment setting has symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet that frame is completely different in terms of how we actually understand why people use drugs, how we actually seek to help them, how we actually seek to offer treatment. In terms of treatment options available, society as a whole kind of understands the concept of sort of a detox or a rehab setting. But in terms of society as a whole, understanding that what can sit under that is post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance. What people understand as post-traumatic stress disorder as a society is so different from how we understand how people are actually presenting with drug and alcohol problems. So the other side of that is if we take that premise that 1 in 2 people that, many of the clinicians in the room, many of the peer support workers are actually engaging with 1 in 2 people who present with this problem. If we think about that, then what is the solution to that, I suppose? If we think about that being the premise, what is the next logical step in terms of how we actually offer treatment? And the next logical step would be to offer treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, I would have thought. Part of that is actually being able to engage with the individual in a trauma-informed way, And it's amazing that we're so much further along that spectrum now than we were, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, in terms of being able to offer that trauma-informed engagement, being able to sit with someone and listen to stories in a safe way for both the person and for the clinician on the other side of the story as well, for them to be able to go home and not think about that and put it away. But then the next step after that is treatment, because delivering trauma-informed care doesn't treat PTSD in and of itself. What we're offering is being able to help the person, walk alongside the person, be there when they're ready to actually engage in some further work around that trauma. I guess now what we're thinking about is what's after that, and that often looks different. It looks like trauma-focused treatment, and trauma-focused treatment is a whole other basket of treatment. It's a basket that largely isn't available in routine care. Again, there are pockets and there's places where people can seek help, but they're few and far between, and they're largely, almost universally, not in the public treatment sector. Even within the private treatment sector, there are very few places that people can actually get evidence-based trauma treatments. So in terms of how we actually bridge that gap, in terms of how we actually think about offering treatments that help people move along, because what I frequently see and causes me immense frustration, because I sit alongside individuals and their families where people are able to reduce what they're using or stop using altogether. But what then happens is the nightmares, the PTSD symptoms, the hypervigilance, the not being able to engage with people around them, not being able to make new friends, find new social connections, engage in a job, take the tram into uni or to work. All of those things get in the way of taking that next step, of being able to get on with your life. And all of those things get in the way of being able to not have a relapse, of actually being susceptible for that to happen again. So if we want to short circuit that cycle, it's about being able to find individuals who are ready to work on trauma, who are actually ready and willing and able, and there are many people in that basket, and being able to think about how we actually offer something that comes after that, to be able to actually offer trauma-focused treatments. We're really trying to kind of advance and push the needle in that space in terms of being able to offer that. And one of the other frustrations that comes up is the fact that these treatments do exist. They're not magical, they exist, and they're actually out there in the evidence base, in the literature. If you seek, you'll find them. But what happens is then that next step of being able to make this case, to make this argument to policymakers, to funders, to investment in terms of implementation and practitioners to be able to take that to the next step, to be able to offer that routinely in care, to be able to get those things off the shelf and test it in real treatment, and being able to give access to people when they need it and where they need it. That's the step that's completely missing in this space in Australia and in many other countries. And that's the step that allows us to be able to help people kind of short circuit that repetitive cycle, to be able to actually not continue along that path. And for myself, my particular area of interest being in women who live with addictions is actually being able to short circuit that process and stop that transgenerational impact of trauma on the next generation, of being able to parent your child in a way that you're actually being able to get on with your own life and being able to actually engage with your child in a way you haven't been able to before. So this is really kind of an area where I think it's of critical importance, because we're actually able to look both upstream and downstream in terms of those impacts, if we're able to kind of change that experience for people. Baden and Hugh too have talked a lot about that sort of adversity that you experience early on, and also they've talked about things that have helped them move on in their recovery. And part of that is 100% social connection and support. The other part of that is psychotherapies as well, and finding the right types of treatment that are going to fit for the individual. And these processes are really things that we really need more research on. I'm going to make a call for research, being a researcher. But they're really things that we need more research on to figure out what works for whom and for when, so that we can, like you said, actually be able to think about a system approach to this, that we're actually not kind of helping people navigate through the system in such a way that they're not given a whole menu of options and say, choose whatever, whenever, and keep calling us, because otherwise we'll, not be able to get you into treatment. What we're saying is we're actually being able to create a system that's adaptive, that's going to be actually responsive, that's going to understand what's going to work for someone when, And when it comes to trauma, we're actually going to be able to offer treatments that help the person engage when they're ready to engage and work through something to resolution. So in terms of treatment approaches, I think we've touched on psychedelics too, and I think that's a really exciting new space that a ton of research has been done now in Australia and internationally. I think what we've got in terms of research capacity here in Australia is a way to look at these substances that wasn't available kind of 50 years ago when that last wave of research into this area happened. We've got a whole range of new techniques and a really whole range of new sort of rigorous frameworks can be put around this to actually assess, do psychedelics work for whom and for what type of presentation and when, and also really understand safety in this space. Psychedelics, like any other substance, have risks, and we don't know what the risks are until we assess them and we are able to kind of give people informed consent and being able to have them. So I think we're really in a space now, for the first time for a long time, where there's actually growing research in this area, and we're able to kind of bring that to a new audience and be able to understand who is actually going to benefit from these sort of treatments. So I think just drawing it all together, I think I just wanted to think about, one thing that we touched on about the complexity factor and the fact that delivering sort of integrated care is often painted as a really wicked problem, a really complex problem. But I guess that's on the back end of the how we deliver integrated care and the back end of how we actually deliver treatment. But on the front end, it's pretty simple. On the front end, from the person actually walking in the room, what it looks like and what it feels like, it's pretty simple. And I think if we can listen to people with lived experience, if we can listen to what they're saying to us, it's pretty plain in terms of what we need to do and what needs to change. We just got to get working on how we get there.
It's really interesting, Patrick. I've sensed, a number of recurring themes tonight, but Shalini, you really did emphasise, as the other three have, the importance of, one size doesn't fit all. This is a very, very personal thing, and what might work for some doesn't work for others. And you mentioned as you're winding up at the end, complex, but actually it has a sort of a simple understanding. Maybe someone comes, someone presents, and without any preconceptions, they need to share what their story is. Now we're at an exciting part of the night because it's over to you. Patrick and Nellie, we have one microphone, so
project your voice.
Project your voice.
we have kind of thought about this, and the kind of thinking was that if someone doesn't speak loud enough.
I've got a really loud voice. Can I ask my question?
Yeah, go for it.
So, just a comment first that I think we have an either-or treatment system. So I'm thrilled to consider trauma-informed care, but the way that we provide treatment now, it's harm reduction or other treatment options. So I'd be interested in a trauma-informed treatment system that allows people to continue using drugs while they're still really suffering from the symptoms of their trauma. But also I'm interested in you guys' thoughts on that we have like a two-speed drug system where if you have money, you can get medicinal cannabis, you can get prescribed opioids, you can get prescribed stimulants. If you don't have money, you get straight drugs. And one's obviously criminalised and the other's not. If you drink at home in private, it's not really a problem, but if you drink in the park, it's a problem. So I'm interested to see how we go forward from there. Sorry.
That's above my pay grade. I have to give Reese that one, I think. But I think in my very sort of early insight into how that worked out is a bulk of the people who want to continue using don't really want treatment, so to speak. That's what I've seen. It's more of a social engagement and work and social support or legal, so to speak, that's what is needed in terms of a system approach. If we think about that, what treatment do they really need? Are they depressed or are they intoxicated at the moment? It's very hard to say. And I've seen thousands of clients, as an outreach worker, as a person who's worked in detox, as someone's worked pre-COVID at the injecting room, seeing, you know, the foot traffic is insane, but they don't come in for treatment. They're not here for treatment, you know. And my boss at the injecting room would say, like Nico Clark would say, you know, they're not here for mental health support, so to speak. They're here to use and to get on with whatever they want to get on. It's not really treatment that they need. And if they did need treatment, that would be a whole other category of its own. And yeah, you were talking about subsidized, you know, prescriptions or legalized subsidized prescriptions, like the hydromorphone trial that, you know, the government might be pushing through. Didn't hear from me. And that, you know, what is that about? That's definitely about the equitable treatment approaches that we need, as well as, you know, more pharmacotherapy, because methadone does work, buprenorphine absolutely works, but accessing it and paying for it, the logistic capacity of it, you know, trying to get that in like Casey, where I work, is very difficult. You know, why aren't we pushing, you know, GPs to train through a little bit of it and have, you know, mandatory 4 patients, something like that. You know, not mandatory, I don't mean that.
Why don't we give it free?
Yeah.
Why is it free to pharmacies, but
exactly,
consumers
exactly.
have to pay?
Exactly, exactly. And you know, as a previous pharmacist myself, doing a lot of opioid replacement therapy, which is kind of weird. Anyway, it was highly unethical and highly profitable, I have to admit.
Yeah.
You know, $5 a pop. I worked in Queensland at the time, and that was enough to pay for myself and my girlfriend at the time that was working as a pharmacy intern as well. So, you know, I agree with that. Those policies and procedures that need to come from top down is what's needed. And there are a lot of avenues for system strengthening, I think, because we don't do the basics right. That's what I've seen. You know, we don't have housing. We don't have, you know, transitional housing or accommodation or emergency accommodations. We don't have a really highly accessible ORT or place to detox quickly. You know, look at the detox waiting lists. You know, you would know very well about those things. So, you know, we don't have those basic. And what's needed for that? We need a good workforce. We need a highly, you know, accommodating and highly paid workforce. You know, the turnover rate at Windana and you know, I won't name the other organizations, have been very high. Yeah, so, you know, we need to get the basics right, I think, first.
And do people not want treatment, or do they just not want the treatment that we've got?
I think a lot of them don't even know the treatment options, actually, you know, and in saying that, you know, it's about that. Do we have access to that population? Do we have that trust and rapport for that population? And sometimes we don't, you know, and that's what we need to work on, I think.
Yep, Alex.
Look, it's not all that complicated. If you want to sell toothpaste or if you want to sell sports cars, you have a range of different options, different colors, different flavors, different pricing structures, and you make sure your product is easy to purchase. And if you want to have drug treatment that gets widely taken up, you have to have as few barriers as possible. Make it as attractive as you can, make it affordable, make it accessible, and particularly for the most vulnerable, the highest risk people, have even lower barriers. Really, if it was a rational universe, we would be paying people to go into treatment and remain in treatment. Treatment's a funny word for what's going on. It's different from the treatment that happens when a neurosurgeon treats us for a brain tumor, because a lot of people actually get over this problem themselves. So part of the trick is having policies that make it a lot easier for people to get out of the rut that they're in. A guy called David Halpin, psychologist in Britain, convinced the then British Prime Minister David Cameron in 2010 that the British government should support vaping. David Cameron was an ex-smoker, and David Cameron got it immediately. Britain supports vaping to a huge extent, and at that time, 2010, smoking rates were higher in the United Kingdom than they were in Australia. Now, smoking rates in the UK are lower than in Australia. And the reason is a lot of people have gone from smoking to vaping, from vaping to nothing. And that's because they could take charge of their own treatment. And smokers don't want to go to doctors, don't want to go into treatment systems. They don't think they've got a medical condition, and they're right. And there's an element of that that is also true for people struggling with heroin or cocaine or amphetamines. So I think it's a matter of rethinking all of this, our treatment systems, and particularly rethinking it from the point of view of the person we're trying to help. They should really be telling us much more, giving us much more feedback. Those guys selling toothpaste and sports cars, they make sure they get a lot of feedback from people buying their products, but we aren't really interested. We've got a restricted market. We struggle with the funding we've got and the conditions and the regulations that we have to follow. We struggle to even meet a fraction of the demand that comes to us. And really, it's better for everyone if it's easier to get help from a drug treatment service than it is to get help from a drug dealer.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the drug dealer wins every time.
I think so. Take another question. And incidentally, can I just not compel you, but suggest that you might want to share your name as well? That was a great question. And Johnny, do you want to share your name? Johnny?
Yeah, I did have a name taken and fell off, John, and yeah, just thank you to everyone on the panel. It's been an amazing discussion. But I had a question to Charlie, just around, like I'm not clinically trained at all, I have lived experience, but I really identified and related with what you talked about, you know, not just treating the substance, but treating the cause. But you put an important qualification in there, when the person is ready. Is there a risk that you can go too early in that stuff in someone's recovery? And I put that in the context of having spoken to a few medical practitioners recently concerned that, for example, some of the private rehabs are going too hard too early. Could be economic driven. They might be getting more out of the health funds for, you know, non-substance treated mental health than others. Is that a risk? And how do you get continuity of treatment so that you don't create a problem as someone's potentially detoxing or early days recovery, be it harm minimisation or abstinence?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think just drawing on from, I think it actually aligns a little bit with what Gabby was also asking about in terms of trauma-informed care and harm reduction. I hope I got that right, Gabby. I think when someone's actually engaging with treatment, no matter, you know, regardless of how we actually define that, it starts with that conversation. The first thing is a conversation and an engagement and a relationship with the person that they're speaking to, the provider. Part of that is also understanding what the person is seeking right in that moment. And I think that comes from building trust. That's not something that, you know, an individual is going to be necessarily going to be able to offer up straight away. But in that trusting relationship that you can build with a clinician or with a provider, it's being able to understand what's driving the problem for that person. And that might take months, it could take years. But in that trusting relationship, by walking alongside someone, you're there when they're actually ready, and when that person's actually ready to do something, or ready to actually understand what it is actually that's underneath that. That can take time too. But I think in terms of going too hard too early, the question I suppose is what too hard looks like, and sometimes that looks like detoxes or multiple detoxes. And I think the detox is very much a question of getting stopped, but the staying stopped takes a longer time, and the staying stopped, as you know, everyone will attest to, is hard and much harder. And for many people, I kind of talk about how that recovery is really that journey, it's not a destination. So it's about how quickly, I suppose, someone is able to kind of get on that journey and recognize that they're on that journey.
Well, there's a question
Hi.
at the back.
Me again.
Yes,
Hi, I'm
you.
Barbara. Just a comment, I think, because in the field of addiction, of course, we work and alongside or across the mental health sector, And I'm just asking the question whether our colleagues in mental health, where a lot of maybe the trauma type counselling or the other types of mental health issues do come to be treated, whether they're with us in addiction in those comments about making it easier for our clients in the addiction services. So are we aligned?
Great question. We had Patrick McGorry in our last virtual one, didn't we? But who of the three would like to kick off on that one?
I can answer that one. I can answer
Great.
that
Well,
one.
why don't you kick it off?
I work in an addiction service that's located in an area mental health service. So we're funded with drug and alcohol funding, but we sit within mental health funding. And I think one of the biggest disconnects in the system is that drug and alcohol treatment is entirely voluntary at all points in the continuum of care. People can be persuaded, but they still have to agree to go. Mental health treatment can be provided involuntarily, and so it's tricky for mental health to work with a client who's involuntary, who has a voluntary substance use problem, because substance use treatment can't be provided against that person's will. So there's just some really significant differences in the treatment systems that make it hard. We've also worked for years and years and years to separate addiction treatment out of mental health, and now we're trying to bring addiction treatment back into mental health. We also struggle to agree on what addiction treatment should be. Is it drug and alcohol treatment? Is it addiction treatment? Is it substance use disorders, substance dependence? Do we call it pharmacotherapy? Do we call it opiate agonist treatment? You know, there's so much name changing over the years that it's hard for people to even keep up. But we're on the cusp of a big reform of bringing together mental health and addiction treatment to provide integrated mental health and addiction treatment within one episode of care by one treating team. So that should, next year? That's supposed to happen next year?
Thank you. I was actually going to ask Alex, any New South Wales experience here that's relevant for our group here?
Well, I said before that telling stories is powerful. Let me tell you about a patient who was referred to me in 1998. He was a psychiatrist, and 3 years earlier than that, his pregnant wife had taken her life. He started going on a downward spiral. He had sex with a patient. He started using heroin. That's why he was referred to me, because of the heroin. And I put him on methadone, and I tried to see him frequently. And he was in a complete mess. I'd see him maybe once or twice a year. I'd make an appointment for him. He'd turn up early, he'd turn up late, turn up with blood-stained knuckles. He'd been sleeping rough, he'd been beaten up, terrible, homeless. Anyway, this kept on going until 2005. He met his partner, his current partner, who has never used drugs, and they got together, and he started studying law, finished his law degree, then he studied mental health law, got a degree in that, then he got a graduate diploma in law, all the time taking heroin. He was getting better though. When I retired 10 years ago, I sought him out and found him, and I said to him, if you'd like, I'll help you to get your medical registration back. He'd been forced to relinquish his medical registration. So we started meeting every 2 weeks, and he would do most of the talking, and I would sit there and listen. Frankly, not much of it made a lot of sense, but that was all right. It was at his pace, and then August the next year he stopped using drugs, and except for continuing to use nicotine, unfortunately. And you can see that I take nicotine and cigarettes very seriously, because 21,000 Australians die from cigarettes every year, more than from alcohol, prescription illicit drugs, HIV, road crashes, and suicide.
Wow.
So it's a big deal, and it's a very big deal for people who use drugs. Anyway, he got his medical registration back in 2016, and he started work as a psychiatrist in 2017. He's still working as a psychiatrist, and he's given up nicotine. So he's a success. Now, what are the lessons to learn from that experience? Well, the lessons to learn from that experience is make sure you walk with your patients, as Shalini has said. That's really very important. Let them take the pace they're comfortable with. Walk with them, listen to them, make suggestions by all means, don't push it too hard. And I had a framework that we worked on together, that we developed together, doing this, doing that, and then when you've done this, do that. And he basically followed the plan that we worked out together. He didn't do it as fast as I would have liked, but he was definitely making progress. And he's made terrific progress. Hasn't been easy, and he's now been back in the system for 6 years, helping his patients at a major hospital, very highly thought of by his supervisors, paying taxes, looking after his aging mother, who's unfortunately declining. Now, tell me that isn't a success. And every bit of this was made more difficult by our policy framework. A policy framework makes every step along the journey harder. So I think, you know, this was a very difficult, complicated case, and I think I wouldn't have had a clue what to do if I'd got this case handed to me a lot earlier. I had learned a lot of lessons, and one of the lessons I'd learned was to put the patient in charge and let him or her make the decisions. And he made, slower than I would have liked, he made the right decisions, and he got there in the end. And he's a hell of a guy. He's an intelligent guy. Okay, he's a very resilient person. He's put up with a lot from the system. But I think there are a lot of lessons in that for all of us. I said before about, in terms of policy, that it's important to try and get incremental change, to start a process of change. It's not a change event we're after, it's after a process that begins. And the same thing works in the clinical field. And very often what works clinically works in policy, what works in policy works in clinically. The two are really, you're basically dealing with dysfunctional systems. You are. That's the problem we've got. So incremental change is what happens in policy, almost always, not heroic changes overnight. And the same thing goes clinically. And it's not continuing drug use that's the problem. It's high-risk drug use, out-of-control drug use that's really the problem. And the first step is to try and decrease the hazardousness, the dangerousness of the drug use. So I think these are powerful stories. We really do know what to do, and we can tell Mr. Albanese and Mr. Andrews, we can really tell them that we've got a pathway of getting out of the mess we're in, and it's ridiculous that after all these years we're still in such a mess. I just want to finish by one thing and saying it's important, as Shalini has said, that we ask, we try and get, if we can, find out what's driving drug use by people. It's important we also ask ourselves, why did we establish these drug prohibition policies in the first place? That's a complicated question, and I won't try and summarize it in 10 words, but it's a very important question. I urge you to read it out. And I tell you what, it's got a hell of a lot to do with colonialism. it's got a hell of a lot to do with racism. What were the first drug prohibition policies in this country? Any idea? I'll tell you what they were. They were the prohibition of opium smoking in the 1850s in South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. And the same policies were introduced in California and British Columbia. Why did they introduce a ban on opium smoking? Because the only people who smoked opium in the 1850s were Chinese working on gold fields. That's it. So the beginnings of drug prohibition in Australia were originated from racism and nothing else. And a lot of it had to do with racism as it developed. More broadly speaking, what happened, why did prohibition become an international drug control system? Why did that develop? That's a bit more complicated, but it's got a lot to do with the British sending opium produced in India to China against the will of the Chinese, and the more powerful British could force the Chinese, including two wars, the two opium wars of the 19th century, which we are still paying a price for. And everybody in China, if you don't know about the two opium wars in China, I can tell you everybody in China knows about those wars. And this is another example of racism. That led to the first Opium Commission in Shanghai in 1911, convened by the United States, attended by 13 countries. That led to a conference in The Hague in 1912, and that led to the Second Opium Commission in Geneva in 1925. And it was the Geneva Conference that banned 3 plant-based drugs: opium and derivatives, coca and derivatives, cannabis and derivatives. And that's basically the system we still have today. It's grown, it's become more entrenched, and then it got tweaked in 1971 when President Nixon was worried about getting re-election, and he wanted to have, here comes race again, and he wanted to have a dog whistle to get elderly, white, wealthy Americans to vote for him in 1972. He was worried about the albatross of the Vietnam War affecting his electoral chances. So he waged a war on drugs, which began on the 17th of June 1971. And the reason for that was that he wanted, he'd been advised by John Ehrlichman that elderly, white, wealthy Americans hated young, poor, black Americans. He couldn't attack young, poor, black Americans by name, but if he said we're going to wage a war on drugs, the elderly, white, wealthy Americans would understand and would come out to vote for him. And what was the result? Landslide victory. Nixon won in 72, winning 49 of the 50 states. I rest my case.
Another 2 quick questions.
Absolutely.
But they've got to be quick questions and quick answers. Go for it, Tim.
Oh, mate. We've heard a bit about that we don't have the right policies in place, or in fact that we have quite the wrong policies in place. We've heard about the structures around drug policy, such as housing and things like that. Each of you has spoken in different ways about what's missing. And the people who can make those decisions are policy makers like myself and obviously people with a bit more power and authority, such as parliamentarians of various stripes. But obviously I'm here, and but in many ways you are preaching to the converted. How, not even the converted, probably the choir, how do you reach the people you need to reach, the people who are easily swayed by those simplistic arguments about just cutting off the drugs will fix everything, all that sort of stuff? How do you bring these stories like Baden's story and like Hugh's story and the evidence to the people who really need it? Because I really need that.
Good question. And I'm going to say, we will keep the answers brief, unfortunately.
3 words: have a drug summit.
No, you need a Prime Minister's daughter to have a drug problem. That's a good start.
Well, we had a Prime Minister's daughter who I knew very well.
That's my point.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point.
Have barbecue. I think reaching out to these core populations is actually easier than we think it is actually. Like I'm working with the indigenous South Sudanese, indigenous in terms of living in Dandenong for so long, homeless youth that have been around there for so long, and how simple it is to reach out to them. It's as simple as a barbecue, as simple as not talking about problems, actually. Yeah, talking about what, what they enjoy, and we can offer it to them. Yeah, really. It's not as difficult, I think, as it sounds sometimes. And I think we often think about the colonial days and the racism and all that sort of stuff. And I try not to sort of take that on board, so to speak. I try to reach over that and have a fun time. Really. And sometimes it's as simple as that. Yeah.
Very quick, I'll keep it quick. I think we talked about changing the minds of politicians. I mean, by doing that, we have to change the minds of voters, and by changing the minds of people whose families, whose communities are affected by addiction. I think that's what Q's speaking to. And I think part of that is also about actually having a framework that is relatable, that people can recognize that their friend, their family member, their niece, their cousin is affected by this. We know that addiction affects 1 in 5 families, so we know that this is, that's the reality of what it is. It's just about changing that conversation. So I think you can do that on an individual level, certainly, and as clinicians, we can talk to our friends and our family members, etc. But I think on a national level, I think what we really need to be having a conversation about is, front and center. When we talk about this, can we have this kind of discussion on a national level? Can we actually change that conversation and remove that stigma that's front and center at the moment that gets in the way of being able to actually advance the conversation any further? Plug for Turning Point's running a Rethink Addiction Summit. It's a national convention in September. And part of that is really driven by this idea that we need to actually talk about the stigma, put that front and center, and actually have a concerted effort to fight stigma. Rather than talking around the stigma, we actually need to have a mobilization of people who work in this space and people in the community outside of the people who work in space, outside of the choir, to actually be able to change that stigma.
Max, you've got the very last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Max. So I am a fortunate beneficiary of trauma-focused addiction treatment, and I've had an incredibly transformative experience as a result. And so it sometimes baffled me, its lack of prevalence in particularly the public system. I was just curious whether any of you had any answers as to particular impediments, maybe whether in policymakers or amongst clinicians, as to why that is currently.
Go for it.
Answer that really quickly. There's 2 impediments. I think there's a conceptual impediment. There's this myth that if we treat trauma and addiction at the same time, that'll make the addiction worse. That is a myth, and it is about the types of treatment that are offered. I mean, example of the fact that treatment can work if it's actually the right treatment and it's delivered effectively. So I think that's one conceptual myth that's very strong. I still have patients all the time who'll come up against clinicians who say, you shouldn't be doing this work, you shouldn't be working on the trauma because you currently have a substance use problem, and you should come back 2 years later when you're in recovery, and then we can work on the trauma. And the reality is most people don't get that. So I think that myth is one of the reasons. The other reason is we don't talk about trauma-focused treatment very much. I think it's still in and amongst that space of something that people aren't talking about, the fact that resolution can happen. Those stories of success, yours, Baden, so many others, aren't shared. And I think that's what also needs to happen to get the community talking about this.
Final comments?
I think one more thing is taking away the punitive component of things from a national level or a local level, including child protection or legal systems. And I think the punishments that people fear the most from having drug use in the background, whatever setting that is always the biggest fear, I think. And I think that's also a very big component of reaching out to poor populations, as Tim was asking, as well as trauma-informed. I think without it, it won't work.
Alex, final word.
A lot of the change that happens in our countries in federations like Australia happens at the state and territory level, not at the federal level. If you think about social policies that have changed in our lifetime, in 1973, South Australia decriminalised homosexuality, and that started a wave across all the other states and territories and helped us to get marriage equality in 2017. It took 49 years to get rid of the criminalisation of abortion. That New South Wales was the last state still doing that until a few years ago. Methadone treatment started in New South Wales, spread around the country. Needle syringe programs also in New South Wales, spread around the country. Drug consumption room, we've still only got 2 and a bit, started in New South Wales. Didn't start with the Fed, none of these started with the federal government. So I think if you want to have change, the state and territory level is really absolutely crucial. Territories can't do much at the moment because they're hamstrung by the laws that the Commonwealth can override the territories. That law also has to be changed so that we can have 8 engines of change rather than just 6. And I do think a drug summit where we get to sit in one room, people with different views, different backgrounds, different experiences of hating drugs, liking drugs, being indifferent to drugs, all of that, and we sit and talk about the mess we're in. That's the way wars end. The Taliban in the United States could talk to each other despite all their differences and work out where their common ground was. If they can do it, surely we can do something about this in the war on drugs and find some common ground with people with very different ideas. And once we start changing, further change then becomes a lot easier. It's all these problems seem absolutely impossible until they're done, and then once they're done, people say, why didn't we do that earlier? Look what happened with marriage equality when it finally happened. People were saying, what the hell were we doing all this time?
Thanks, Alex. And can I just wrap up tonight? We acknowledged Powerhouse and Lord Summers Camp, but we want to do that again, Patrick. They're great community partners of First Step. And our wonderful panel, but Baden, thanks for kicking yourself on absolutely the right note. It takes a lot of courage for Baden to do what he did tonight and share his story. You did the same thing, Q. Thank you. Wonderful, Shalini, what you're doing day in, day out, and Alex, from where you have come from. And wouldn't have happened without Nellie and Patrick and the wonderful team at First Step. Anyway, the highlight of tonight now starts because we've got the formal stuff out of the way. I'm going to share with you, I've got the running sheet which says bump out at 9 o'clock. Is that right, Nellie? So we might have another half hour if any of you have a few more minutes to just share. And I apologise, haven't we just scraped the surface? Haven't we just scraped the surface? But nonetheless, thanks each and every one of you for coming along tonight. Fantastic.